just to make it easy for anyone who's not able to attend. And we're going to jump back in. Start off where we left off. I miss when these were our executives, just because I find the similar hairstyles very entertaining. But let's talk a little bit about the last branch of the US and the UK, which is where we left off. So we'll wrap that up. The UK has a fairly recent new prime minister. It is no longer Boris Johnson. It is Miss Truss, as we see here. And also the president of the United States changed just a couple of years ago. In case I'm the first one telling you, we now have Joe Biden as the president of the United States. I know, Ben. Yep, news to you. So these two executives, I think, serve as a good entry point, like the other, aspects of these governments that we've talked about. These serve as a good entry point to looking at why these positions in the United States aren't necessarily normative of what we see around the rest of the world. So even as we talk about, the legislatures and the way that they may look similar or not, as we talked about with the UK, the House of Representatives in the United States and the House of Commons in the UK look similar, other than the fact that you see a lot more representation of different political parties in a parliamentary system. Little bit more difference with the House of Lords and the Senate, just as the positions in the House of Lords go back a lot further and are split between both religious representation from the Church of England and actual proportional representation, which still tends to be kind of a based in the landed gentry, as it always has been in the UK. Then we have the executive branch. And, in the UK, we have this very strong influence of the Queen, but the Queen, the monarchy, does not actually sit in the executive branch. It is a semi-executive type of position. But we have to understand two distinct types of executives around the world. And that is the executives who are the head of government and the executives who are head of state. Now, separating those out is sometimes a new concept, especially if you are very used to the United States' system, because the United States uses the president as both. If you go back and look at the Constitution and the things that the Constitution gives the president as far as powers, you see a lot of things as far as the president is responsible for signing treaties with other nations. The president serves as that figurehead of the United States when it comes to acting on an international stage, which granted in 1789 was a very different international stage than we see today. But when it comes to representing the United States on an international stage, all of those responsibilities fall under the presidency. But the president is also responsible for overseeing domestic affairs in the United States. They're responsible for heading their political parties. Something, if you've taken 1,000 from me, you know well, but political parties don't exist in the Constitution, which is really kind of weird because it's not like the idea of political parties didn't exist. They're talked about in the Federalist Papers pretty extensively. And Madison warns against the existence of political parties. And yet also acknowledges that they are functionally inevitable, and then goes on to found one of the first major political parties of the country with Thomas Jefferson. So political parties probably should have been somewhere, somehow indicated as existing in the Constitution, but they aren't. Instead, they are a very flexible, very semi-political set of organizations. And so after the fact of the Constitution, it started to develop that the president also sat at the head of his or her respective political party. So seeing that, seeing the president as not only a representative on the foreign stage, but also a representative in the domestic stage and the head of a political party, functionally, if not, in title and actuality, seeing that kind of shift and seeing the president take on these multiple different roles is somewhat uniquely American. That's not exactly what you see in most other developed democracies. This is also something that changes a little bit with each president, and that is, not just saying Democrats and Republicans, it's saying that over the past approximately 50 to 70 years, we've seen increases in the amount of power that the president has, what the president can do within the context of those constitutional duties. But it is not, a pure like power grab by the president. Very often, this just means that the legislature, which there's a whole, section we can talk about on the legislature, but with the United States legislature not continuing to grow after the 1910s, but the country continuing to grow in its, population and not growing evenly, we get to this point where there's this, kind of uneven representation in the legislature, but the legislature is representing a heck of a lot of people. It's representing 330 million people. And so it has a lot to do. Even though we complain all the time that the legislature doesn't do anything, Congress does do a lot. It passes a lot of laws. It deals with a lot of committee issues. It is, it is the direct target of all lobbying activity at the federal level in the United States. So Congress does a lot. And there are a lot of things that it functionally can't do anymore, that it has to find other ways to get those things accomplished. So in that, post-50s period, we've seen a lot of powers from the legislature delegated over to the executive branch. And as the executive branch is the realm of the president, that is something that essentially the president's power and functional oversight has increased even more in that time. That is a theory known as the imperial presidency. So if you ever hear the term imperial presidency, that's what it's referring to, is this increase in power for the president. And that is responsive to the individual presidents we see. So the ways that George W. Bush executed that power was very different from the way that Barack Obama executed that power, was very different from the way that Donald Trump executed that power, and is fairly different from the way that currently Joe Biden is not exercising that power as much as the previous three. But that in its own way is a way to approach the presidency. So from all of that, we can take that the president in the United States serves as both the head of government and the head of state. They are heading up the government that is formed. They do that by appointing cabinet officials, appointing the heads of the different departments in the executive branch, overseeing the political parties domestically, somewhat representing the people in a domestic fashion. I don't have time to go into the electoral college system and why that's. If you want to talk about that, feel free anytime, call me up. I will give you many, many hours of conversation about the electoral college. That is what I studied. That was what I did my master's dissertation about, was the electoral college as a functional bureaucratic failure in the United States. So that's fun. But I'm happy to talk to people about it. It's its own set of issues, but we do get out of it this interesting view that the president serves as a representative of all people in the country, as opposed to this very representative system that we have set up in the legislature, where that's where people are actually represented. It also doesn't make sense because in a two-party system, the president is always going to only represent one party. We have not had a wonderful Jed Bartlett from the West Wing elected in this country ever. So we wind up with presidents who come from one of the two parties and will inevitably represent that party more than the other party. And that holds with it some very big implications when it comes to questions of legitimacy and questions of having a mandate to, rule the country, which again is not what our president is supposed to do. But those are questions that we end up asking because of how prevalent and powerful the president has become. But you can see here that's not the case in a traditional parliamentary system. So in the UK, the head of state is the Queen. It is a separate person. I'm sorry, the King. Damn it, I told you I was going to struggle with remembering that we have a king now. The head of state is the king. It's the monarch. Separating that out and having the head of government be a completely different person is a really interesting way to do this. You create a bit more stability in a system where you separate these two positions out. So in the UK, the head of government is the prime minister. The prime minister still has some of those significant powers, as you can see here, overseeing the civil service, the bureaucracy of a country is immense. And that is something that both of our executives here functionally do. But that is a much more important that is a much more important power for the prime minister to exert. And by leading the party, by being elected by the party in the UK, the prime minister can serve in a couple of different roles that are very domestically minded. But the prime minister also then doesn't have a lot of functional power on that global stage. They are much more concerned with the continuity of government within the parliamentary system, within the UK in this instance. So as we've seen, there have been a few changes to prime minister. We often see prime ministers willing to or able to step down from their position much more frequently than a president. That might also be because presidents are usually elected on a fairly, consistent basis. We have this, every 4 years, we have a presidential election, as opposed to a prime minister may not change as frequently. That just depends on whether the party keeps winning and whether the winning of that party means that they maintain the same kind of coalition to form the government. If that coalition continues to like the same prime minister, then we don't see much change in prime ministers. If they don't, then we end up with Boris Johnson instead. And then Boris Johnson goes until he realizes that he can't really effectively be prime minister and that he isn't getting a lot done. So he steps down and allows a new prime minister to be selected. Yeah, Jacob, I saw you put your hand up.
So, sorry, I missed this like just a few seconds ago. So prime minister deals more with like domestic rather than international. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, you will still see some prime ministers who have a presence on the international stage. I'm thinking specifically like Angela Merkel, who was prime minister, if functionally her title was chancellor, but she's effectively the prime minister, same position in Germany. She did have a very strong presence on the international stage, even though the president of Germany is truly supposed to be the head of state type of position and serve as that representative. So you do see some prime ministers because if you were to balance the two, right, head of government and head of state, really the head of government is more powerful. It should have more responsibility. It should have more power because it's responsible for the day-to-day functioning of the country. The head of state is out there on that international stage, is going to the United Nations to speak on behalf of the country, is meeting with world leaders in the G8 summit. Things like that is what the head of state is supposed to be doing. And so from a strong and weak state position, which if you remember back to, I guess that would have been 3-4 weeks ago when we were doing our intro stuff, when we were talking about states, a strong and a weak state are not their strength on an international scale, right? It's not how they interact with other countries. It's not how they can bully other countries into getting things done. A strong and a weak state is how much control they exert over the population in the country. So North Korea was my example of a very strong state because it exerts a lot of control within its country. And so the head of the North Korean government, Kim Jong-un, is a very powerful position to hold, right? The United States, not as strong of a state. Obviously, on the international stage, we try to be, we try to act as a strong country, but a strong state isn't what we're striving for. We don't strive for a lot of control over the functional day-to-day lives of our citizens. And so, there's more power in that domestic side because it's just more frequent. The problems that come up, the issues that a country has to deal with are much more frequently internal than they are external. And so, yes, that head of government, which, as you see here, the prime minister is in the UK. In the US, the president is both. So it kind of gets all muddied. And that's why we have to talk through separating these two out, because we'll see them separated in most other countries, except for North Korea. It's the same person kind of a thing. So, but yes, the head of government should be a little bit more powerful, a little bit more prominent of a position than the head of state will be. And this is an important distinction to remember, because like I said, when we talk about Germany, the interaction of these two, a little bit different. When we talk about Iran, which is the interaction of a president and a supreme ayatollah, very different, very different interaction between those two positions, even though they still hold these functional services. One of them is the head of government, one of them is the head of state. So even though we see that echoed in a lot of different countries, the way that the two may interact is still going to be, it'll still vary by country and give us a good point of comparison to talk about why certain countries are certain ways. Does that answer your question, Jacob? Did I hit it? Okay, cool. Yeah. So we have seen quite a few prime ministers appointed, going all the way back to Churchill under the former Queen. We have not yet seen a new prime minister appointed under the King, so we don't know yet quite what that relationship is going to look like in the UK. But the relationship between the prime minister and the Queen has served as a really strong guiding line for the UK during her entire service. There are prime ministers that she got along better with and prime ministers that she didn't get along with quite as well. All of the records of her interactions with people like Thatcher are really fascinating to read. But they, in general, the Queen has held the prime minister in very high esteem. And that is something that is important to that ongoing functionality of the UK government over these past decades, because the Queen has by and large approved most of the things that the Prime Minister has supported. The Prime Minister, because they are selected by the government, by the coalition government of a parliament, the Prime Minister tends to have a lot of support for putting forward laws bills, those will be issued from the prime minister's office, which is another pretty strong distinction between the prime minister and the president, because the president sits at the end of the lawmaking process, right? They serve as a check on the legislature of the veto, but the veto can be overridden in the presidential system. So the legislature really holds, that force of introducing, directing laws, and setting the agenda of laws. Agenda setting policy, agenda setting principle comes from the legislature in the United States. In the UK, the prime minister is really the one setting that agenda, deciding what kinds of laws are going to go before Parliament and get argued. I also encourage you, if you've ever watched C-SPAN and been bored out of your mind by legislative discussions in the United States, I really encourage you to go watch recordings or live parliamentary discussions, because they are much more entertaining. And they are much more lively, and you get a lot more people who will, yell and cheer or boo or respond to the things being said on the floor of Parliament. So by all means, if you want a slightly more entertaining way of watching a legislature, go watch a Parliament, because they're much more fun, in my opinion. Okay. Any other final questions on? I know this is the briefest of overviews of US and UK. Or do you want me to move on to communism? We feeling good? Okay. So communism and post-communism, the other white meat. No, that's not what we call it. The other side of the world. As we talked about, this was the big distinction, right? We had, after World War II, we entered into a period where we were trying to figure out how the world was going to exist. We created the League of Nations as the precursor at the time to what would become the United Nations. We created the League of Nations to give countries a voice, to give different countries the ability to interact on an international stage without it having to be just war or peace treaties, which up until that time were most of the interactions that countries had with one another. We had ended the period of aggressive colonialization. You could still argue to an extent the US and the UK continued that mindset of colonialism for a very long time. The UK really capitalized on the end of World War II to, I don't know, the Falkland Islands have no reason to be part of the UK at all, but strategic sheep purposes, I'm sure. But these countries did continue some of the mindset, but we were also moving into this new era of the major powers that had just won World War II were functionally very different sets of powers. In the West and Western Europe and the United States, we had extremely successful, now economically booming democracies. And in the Eastern Bloc and the East, we saw extraordinarily successful communistic states. And so the stage was set, obviously, to have this global interaction of two very different kinds of ideologies and two different understandings of how we should organize ourselves, not only as states, but truly as countries. That's why we start to blur some of the definitions in these. I talked about communism previously under the ideology factor and not as much as the form of government factor, even though, as we'll talk about, there are ways that you can structure your government to be communistic. Communism is also a form of economy, as opposed to democracy, which is a form of government. Democracy is often paired with capitalism, right? That's how we see it expressed in most Western countries. That's not a strict rule. You could pair a communistic economy with democratic representation. You could do the opposite. You could have well, okay, it would be very hard in justification to have a communistic country with a capitalistic economy. You still have to have some of that communism in the economic system. But as we'll see, moving into Russia and China, the strongest communistic countries now, post 1989, post fall of the Berlin Wall, post breakup of the Soviet Union, the strongest communistic countries in the world now have incorporated aspects of capitalism into their economy. They are not pure communistic countries in the same way that the United States is not a pure democracy. Pure expressions of any of these systems don't tend to last. And that is partially explained by, not caused by, but explained by some of the thinkings of Karl Marx. So we have to talk about Marx. Talking about Marx does not mean an endorsement of Marx. So please, on the message boards on, rate my professor or whatever, don't go off saying that I'm a communist. I'm not. Some of the ideas are cool, but I'm not. I like money. But we do have to talk about them. And in talking about them, sometimes it can sound a little bit pro-communist because the basic ideas are things that people tend to agree on, right? Like you can start any new form of government you want with some basic ideas that people agree on. And then it's always once you get into the details that people start to be like, maybe we shouldn't, kill the rich just because they're rich. But Marx and, we have to talk about Engels, his best buddy. Marx and Engels were fans of the socialist movements that were happening in Europe at the time. So back in the 1800s, there was a rise in, this sort of soft socialism. It was primarily among the educated and the slightly wealthier classes, not the fully wealthy, aristocracy, but the proletariat type of, the common man, but still wealthier side of the common man. And those groups were really starting to have problems with capitalism. And the problems that they have with capitalism, I think, are pretty obvious on the surface of capitalism. Capitalism relies on constant growth. As soon as a capitalistic society stops experiencing growth, you start to experience the negative sides of capitalism. So this is the argument that capitalism's really good for building a country, but not really good at maintaining a country. Because capitalism, if left unchecked for too long, will inevitably result in inequity. A capitalistic system is built, and I'm not making this up. This is a long-standing way of understanding the difference between capitalism and communism. Capitalism is built like a chair factory, right? We have chairs. Okay, I've seen Reese rocking in his chair sometimes during class. I'm sitting on a chair that I got from Walmart. I'm going to be upgrading soon. I don't know if you noticed, I have a Secret Labs chair in the corner. So I'm going to look like a pro gamer instead of a professor here soon. But I have
make your own chair really sad that you're upgrading. You're going to offend your old chair.
That's fine. This chair can suck it. It's not a good chair. But okay, chairs exist, right? We like to sit on things. So you've got a chair factory. And the chair factory was probably built by, I don't know, Jacob, you just spoke up. So Jacob owns the chair factory. He has long inherited family wealth and recognizes that everyone needs a chair. So he should build chairs. So he starts a chair factory, gets all the materials together to be able to build chairs, puts his own money into starting this chair factory. Now, Jacob's a little bit tired. because he's been sitting like listening to me lecture for like 40 minutes. But no, he's tired. We're all tired. But Jacob's getting a little bit tired. And he realizes like there's just too much demand for chairs. He can't produce enough chairs to be able to meet the demand. So he goes out and he finds Reese and Ven. Reese and Ven are two strapping young lads who he thinks are going to be able to build the chairs. So he goes out, teaches them how to build the chairs, says, hey, come work for me. You can build these chairs. I will pay you to build the chairs. And Jacob's a smart business guy. So he's like, all right, I've been selling these chairs for $100. If I increase the price, I'm probably going to lose some customers. Like I need to keep the customer base. So if the materials for the chair cost me, $15, if I pay Reese and Ven each, $10 per chair that they produce, they're making $10 that they didn't make before. I'm still getting a good profit because, $75 of that chair I'm still getting. Yeah, it's less than my 100, but like I don't have to work now, which is really nice. And, everyone seems to benefit in this situation. I don't have to increase prices. Reese and Ven get paid more than they did before, and I'm still making a fairly good profit. So this goes on for a while. Reese and Ven eventually, still strapping young lads, slightly older strapping young lads, start families, have other people to provide for. Suddenly that $10 for each chair, I mean, they kind of start to realize like, hey, Jacob's getting like $75 per chair. We're getting 10. This seems like a little bit unfair, right? What are you gonna do? Reese and Jacob, what do you do?
Start our own business, maybe spice up the chairs a little to make them a little different.
Sorry, I should say Reese and Ven. Jacob, I'll have you input in a second. Yeah, Reese and Ven. So yeah, new chair company. Just forget Jacob.
I mean, alternatively, right? Jacob needs the labor. You're producing chairs at a standard price. You already have a customer base with Jacob. You don't have to find a new one if you stay with him. So if you negotiate some sort of higher margin of return on your labor, then you have an established customer base and you're making more money without having to start from the ground up.
And that would be Jacob's argument to you, right? Like Jacob provides a lot. He buys all of the materials for you to make the chairs. He provides the customer base. He probably, in modern day would claim that he does the marketing and the sales side of these chairs. So Jacob still thinks that he's working hard and really does deserve the money that he's getting. Yeah, so there's an argument there to, all right, maybe you go off and do your own thing if you think that you can handle that. Or, you try to negotiate with Jacob for maybe a little bit more money. Maybe Jacob wouldn't mind too much parting with $15 per chair instead of $10 per chair, right? Now, Jacob, what's your counter to that?
Well, like I would probably say that negotiation is fair, but I feel like I should still be making the majority of the profit because it was originally my idea and originally like the way that I built the company from the ground up.
So Jacob's counter argument is that he invented the idea of chairs. No, Jacob's counter argument is that he's the owner of the factory. He does provide the basic materials. He also taught you how to make chairs, right? Like there's a lot of reasons that Jacob feels he should still be making that profit on each chair and doesn't have a lot of incentive to decrease what that profit is. So you run into with this, basic chair idea. This is the basis of capitalism, right? It's the recognition of a demand the creation of a supply, and the alienation of labor. The alienation of labor is talking about the fact that Reese and Venn are the one producing the chairs. They're the ones hand making these chairs. They may have been taught by Jacob, but they're the ones making the chairs. Jacob is still profiting off of these chairs. Reese and Venn are profiting as well, but they have that direct production. Jacob is alienated from the actual labor. He's not the one making and selling the chairs. So when we talk about alienation of labor, when Marx talks about alienation of labor, that's what he's talking about. Jacob, just give me 1 second because I
All right, gotcha. And then yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to mention one more thing with this. This is the like simplest version of alienation of labor. If you want to like really understand the alienation of labor and some of its problems, look at a university and count how many associate deans exist in a university. Now, associate deans are absolutely necessary to the structure of a university, but if you want to talk about alienation of labor, that gives you that structural problem. Look at a company and ask how many vice presidents does a company really need to continue functioning? If the entire board of vice presidents was shipped off to an island for 3 weeks, would the iPhone still get made? Probably. Jacob?
So I think like going back to what would Venn and Reese do if they want more money. I think like within chair making, I think this happens a lot of times in companies, is the state of their career or their job right now is just chair making, and eventually they'll progress in their career and then like go to higher quality chairs, making more money, and then maybe eventually start their own company. But I still kind of feel like there's always those type of people that are still in like the basic level of chair making, that's my target audience for my company. You know what I mean?
Yeah, chairs have got to get made, right? The argument here is there is still a demand. So if Reese and Venn decided that they deserve more money, that they don't like this split that you're making, there's probably Odin and Jean-Luc are out here too. They're not making chairs at the moment, but maybe they're getting paid $7 an hour to, I don't know, go shovel mud off of a sidewalk. Other job. I don't know why that's the first one that came.
Definitely my favorite pastime.
Thank you. Okay, good. When you're teaching, just never question where your brain is when you're teaching, because you're thinking too hard about this stuff. Okay, so Odin and Jean-Luc are over here making $7 an hour. Reese and Venn could ask for more money, and then Jacob could just say, nah, like I can get Odin and Jean-Luc to come in here and do this for $9 an hour. Then I'm making $1 more per chair. I'm making $1 more. You get the economy of this. There's always going to be those competing factors. And with capitalism, the structural drive is always going to be to lower costs and increase production. And that has been the driving force of capitalism since its inception, since we created money and realized that there can be inequity in the production value. The more that Jacob is alienated from the actual labor that he is benefiting from, the more capacity there is for this inequity to exist. He can still be making that amount of money, but eventually, unless there's a government there to tell him not to, he could just say, like, why am I paying Venn and Reese $10 a chair? Why don't I just pay them $5 a chair and then hire on 2 more, Odin and Jean-Luc? I'll have all 4 of them making chairs, and I can pay them $5 because who's going to tell me I can't? Like, at least they're not raking mud off of a sidewalk. Like, you can see on this very basic level how this develops and why this was such a problem for people in the 1800s. The major democracies, specifically, the democracies that existed at the time in the United States, France, and the UK, we're all seeing this significant growth in the disparate inequity between classes. And so this idea came along, this socialist idea came along of saying, why don't we all just get along? Let's make it so that we have social programs in place that control this kind of split in economy, that make it so that Reese and Venn are guaranteed a certain amount of income for their work, and that the amount of income that Jacob can profit off of that can be limited by the government. Along came Marx and Engels and a few others in these social groups. And, at the time, the socialist groups were pretty much just happy to sit around in bars, drinking and talking about how nice it would be if they could fix the system. Marx and Engels came along and said, you're going to have to actually do something. If you ever want this system to change, you have to change it. You can't just sit around hoping that it's going to change on its own. And the base problem of why it will never change in the way that you want it to is that the people benefiting from the chairs are the ones in power. The ones making the chairs aren't. They're too busy making chairs to go sit in government. Jacob, on the other hand, has plenty of time on his hands to go be a member of parliament and to, create the laws that govern how much he can make off of making these chairs. So if you want to fix this system, you have to separate the base system, the production of labor, from the superstructure, the governments, the religious organizations, the people that are in this system to reinforce this system. I mentioned religious organizations because Marx and Engels specifically cited the Catholic Church as reinforcing this disparate system through the Middle Ages. And religion, by and large, has, found a very strong pull in being able to attract those people who feel that they could do better in life by reassuring them that there is some kind of other reward for their hard work. That is, a lot of what major religions base their promise of an afterlife on. I'm not saying it's true or not, any religion is better or worse than another, but they identified that most of the major religions in the world served this function in much the same way that governments were serving this function. That governments were created and were intentionally suppressing people's hope for a better life or desire to move up by reinforcing these structures that existed. Yeah, Reese.
Wasn't the Catholic Church also at the time pre modern era, like during feudalism, they were making pretty good profit on everyone, showing that they were kind of, I would almost say, I don't want to offend anyone here, but their structure was very close to government and a business at the same time, which is unique from the Protestant Church, Islam, where they're less structured, but that did stand out to me.
Absolutely. And the superstructures that exist were very interested in the maintenance of their position. The Catholic Church has always tithed its members. Yes, these superstructures are entirely concerned with maintaining their level of position as well. And that was what Marx came along and said, look, if you want to fix this system, you're going to have to do it violently. You're going to have to overthrow the superstructures in order to reinforce the base. So he, they write the Communist Manifesto, they write all of these ideas out, basically saying that if any of these systems are going to change, if we're going to reinforce Rees and Venn and take Jacob down a notch, we're going to have to do it violently. And we're going to have to restructure the entire system to fix it. Capitalism will never fix itself because it has no desire to. There's no incentive in capitalism to make things equal. You can win capitalism, right? And there are a lot of people like Elon Musk who have figured out how to win at capitalism. That is different from this world that Marx and Engels envisioned. And I'm going to skip ahead real, no, we'll finish talking about this and then we'll start. Oh yeah, we have another class on Wednesday. We're fine. This is the basic principle that led to this creation of communism. And this was a very popular idea that was adopted in many monarchies around the world, where they had this central figurehead that they could essentially pin this on. We saw in the French Revolution influences of this. The French Revolution ended up being semi-democratic in its desires. France did not go fully democratic until after the second revolution that they had to have, which was a much softer revolution after the death of Napoleon. But we see, this desire to push in this direction. We see very significant socialist voices running through that, running through the rest of the 1800s in France. And we see it even stronger in countries like Russia, where we see an uprising. And I have, just for the entertaining fact of Russia functioning on a different calendar than the West does now. We function under the Gregorian calendar. They function under an Orthodox calendar. So the names, the February Revolution and the October Revolution, are actually pretty misleading because that's not when they happened. But we see this cascade of revolutions that happen to attempt to instill communism in countries like Russia. Now, the thing to remember, the last message of today's class, is that even though we have these dates, we have the February Revolution, which happened, it was functionally happening between the 8th and the 16th of March. That is not the beginning and end of a revolution. A revolution does not end. The fighting may end, but a revolution is not successful until the change that the revolution strives for has been implemented in a stable, functioning government moving forward. So anytime we talk about these or any other revolutions moving forward, I want you to remember, revolutions are not a done deal. They don't happen and then they're over. They must be a continuing facet. And that was something that Marx got wrong. Marx said in the Communist Manifesto that once the revolution is done, the new government can continue to function. That's a very idealistic way of looking at things and doesn't work on the continuum that he himself suggested, which is what we'll start with next class. Rees.
It just reminded me of one thing. Iran, their Revolutionary Guard, I think that kind of plays into it, that in their mindset, they're protecting the revolution, they're continuing the revolution. The revolution's not over. 50 years later, I think that's a really unique thing to see there.
Absolutely. Well said. And we will absolutely talk about that when we get to Iran towards the end of the semester, and why Iran has just been in a continuous revolution since that's the thing, since whenever you want to mark the start of the Iranian Revolution, whether you want to take that back to 79 or 70 or 64, any of those could be starting places for the ongoing Iranian Revolution. So very good. Thank you all. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You
See on
too.
Wednesday.
Bye.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's see, where's my stop record button?